If you do these 10 things, you're not normal. If you do even 3 of the things on this list, people around you have already started acting strange around you. And you probably haven't figured out why. Not hostile. Not cold. Strange. A little more careful with their words. A little less comfortable interrupting you. A little quieter when you walk into a room they were just being loud in. You felt it. Maybe you brushed it off as paranoia. It isn't. It's a response. Human beings can sense abnormality before they can explain it, and what you're about to hear isn't a list of impressive achievements or hustle culture nonsense about waking up at 5 a.m. This is a list of internal shifts, quiet, invisible, almost nobody talks about them, and once they happen inside a man, the outside world reacts to him differently whether it wants to or not. Stay to the end, because number 7 is the one that gets misunderstood the most. And there's a moment around the halfway mark where I need to tell you something most self-improvement content will never admit, because it isn't flattering. It's just true. Let's start with why normal is even the right word to use here, because it's not an insult to normal people. Most human behavior, when you strip away the noise, runs on a small number of ancient survival programs. React to threats immediately. Seek approval from the group. Avoid discomfort. Protect the ego at all costs. These programs kept our ancestors alive for a very long time, and there's no shame in running them. Almost everyone does, almost all the time, without ever questioning it. But a small number of people, across every era, have learned to interrupt those programs. Not eliminate them, nobody eliminates them, not even the Stoics who spent their whole lives studying this exact question. Interrupt them. Create a gap between the impulse and the action. Epictetus, who spent his early life enslaved before becoming one of the most respected teachers in the ancient world, said that it isn't events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. That single idea, sitting quietly underneath everything on this list, is the difference between a man who's run by his programming and a man who started, slowly, to run it instead. Here's the first one, and it's the foundation everything else sits on. You feel the anger, the insult, the provocation, in full, and you don't act on it in the moment. This is not suppression. Suppression is when you swallow the anger and let it rot somewhere inside you, and it always finds a way out later, usually somewhere it doesn't belong. This is something else entirely. It's feeling the full heat of the reaction and simply not handing it the wheel. Seneca wrote an entire book to his brother on this exact subject, because his brother had a temper he couldn't control. And Seneca's argument was blunt: anger promises strength but delivers destruction, and the only real defense against it is delay. Not denial. Delay. Let the first wave pass. What's left after it passes is usually a much smaller, much clearer problem than the one your anger was screaming about. Most people never build this gap. Someone insults them, and the words are out of their mouth before their brain even finishes registering what happened. That's not passion. That's not honesty. That's just an untrained nervous system operating exactly the way it did in a man from 10,000 years ago who needed instant aggression to survive a predator. You don't live around predators anymore. You live around people testing to see what gets a reaction out of you, and every time you give them one, you hand them a small piece of control they didn't earn. The second thing is quieter, and it's one almost nobody notices in themselves until it's pointed out. You stop narrating your plans before they happen. Somewhere along the way, most people picked up the habit of announcing their intentions. New diet, new business idea, new relationship boundary, new version of themselves, announced, usually to more people than necessary, usually before a single step has actually been taken. There's a reason this feels good in the moment. Talking about a goal activates a similar reward response in the brain as actually achieving it, which means the announcement itself can quietly satisfy the urge that was supposed to drive the action. You get the social credit without doing the work, and then the motivation that was supposed to carry you through the hard part has already been spent on the applause. A man who's stopped doing this isn't being secretive out of pride. He's protecting the only resource that actually gets things done, the tension between where he is and where he wants to be. The moment you announce the goal, that tension releases early. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire and could have announced anything he wanted to an audience of millions, wrote his private thoughts in a journal never meant to be read by anyone else. Not for public accountability. For private clarity. He wasn't performing discipline. He was practicing it, where no one could see, which is the only place it actually counts. The third one costs people relationships, and it's worth sitting with. You forgive without needing the other person to apologize first. This sounds soft until you actually try to do it, and then you realize it might be one of the hardest things on this entire list. Most people hold grudges as a form of leverage. As long as I'm angry, you owe me something. But Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the middle of a military campaign, reminded himself constantly that people wrong you out of ignorance, not malice. And that holding on to the wrong does more damage to the one holding it than to the one who caused it. This isn't about being a doormat. You can forgive someone completely and still never let them back into your life the same way. Forgiveness and access are two different decisions. Most people confuse them, which is exactly why they stay stuck in resentment. They think releasing the anger means reopening the door, so they keep the anger just to keep the door shut. You don't need the anger for that. The boundary can hold on its own. And this is where people around you start reacting differently, whether they can explain why or not. Here's the fourth, and this is where people start getting uncomfortable, because it touches the ego directly. You walk away from arguments you know you could win. Winning an argument and being right are not the same achievement, and most people never separate them. A disagreement starts, and somewhere in the middle of it, the actual subject disappears completely, replaced by a much older, much more primitive question: who is going to dominate this exchange? A man who's interrupted his default programming can feel that shift happening in real time, and he can choose, deliberately, to let the argument go even when he has the better point. Because he understands that being right in a conversation nobody remembers next week isn't worth the cost of the relationship it damages. Epictetus told his students plainly that if someone tells you you've lost an argument, and you actually did, that's growth, not defeat. Most people treat every disagreement like their identity is on the line. It almost never is. It just feels that way because the ego has hijacked what should have been a simple exchange of information. Now here's where I need to stop and tell you something, because if I don't say this clearly, the rest of this list will get misunderstood. And that misunderstanding is exactly where most men get this completely wrong. None of this is about becoming detached, robotic, or above other people. That version of not normal is just coldness wearing a philosophy costume, and it's everywhere online right now: men performing stillness, performing indifference. Performing a version of calm that's actually just numbness with better marketing. That's not what any of the Stoics were teaching, and it's not what this list is describing. Marcus Aurelius wept. Seneca grieved deeply and wrote about it honestly. These weren't men who stopped feeling things. They were men who stopped being controlled by what they felt. There's an enormous difference, and if you take away the wrong lesson from a list like this, you'll end up isolated, mistaken for wise when you're actually just shut down. And confused later in life about why nobody feels close to you. The goal was never distance. The goal was always command, over your own reactions, not over your capacity to feel. With that said, here's the fifth one, and it's about discipline in a place nobody's watching. You keep your standards when there's zero chance of being caught not keeping them. This is the real test, and everyone fails it more often than they'd like to admit. It's easy to be disciplined when someone's watching: a coach, a partner, a coworker, a camera. The real shift happens in the empty apartment at 11 at night when nobody would ever know if you skipped the thing you said you'd do. Seneca had a practice of reviewing his entire day every single evening, alone, asking himself honestly what he'd done well and where he'd failed, with no audience and no performance involved. That nightly audit, done in complete privacy, is where character actually gets built. Public discipline is theater. Private discipline is the real construction site. The sixth one is going to sting for some of you, and that's fine, because it needs to. You stop chasing people who've already shown you they've made their distance clear. Most people can read disinterest perfectly well. They just refuse to accept what they're reading, because accepting it means confronting a version of themselves they don't want to look at, the version that isn't automatically wanted. Isn't automatically chosen, isn't automatically enough. So instead they keep showing up, keep reaching out, keep interpreting silence as a puzzle to be solved rather than an answer already given. Epictetus drew a hard line here that most people find almost uncomfortable in its bluntness. Some things are within your control, and other people's feelings toward you are not one of them. You can be excellent, consistent, and genuinely good, and someone can still choose not to want you around. That's not a reflection of your worth. It's just a fact sitting outside your control, and a man who's interrupted his old programming stops spending his energy trying to control what was never his to control in the first place. This is the point where normal behavior starts breaking down completely. Seventh, and this is the one I mentioned at the start, the one that gets misread constantly. You accept blame quickly, without spiraling into self-punishment afterward. People confuse these two things constantly, and the confusion costs them years. Accepting blame is a clean, fast, factual acknowledgement. I was wrong, here's what I'll do differently. Spiraling is something else entirely. It's replaying the mistake on a loop, narrating your own inadequacy to yourself for days, turning a single error into evidence for a much larger, much crueler story about who you fundamentally are. A man who's done the real work can say, "That was my fault," in 5 seconds and mean it completely. And then move forward without dragging the mistake behind him like a weight he has to carry for the rest of the week. The people around him notice this immediately, because it's rare. Most people either refuse to admit fault at all, or admit it and then punish themselves so visibly that everyone around them ends up managing their emotions instead of just moving forward with the actual solution. 8, and this one is deceptively simple. You say no without over-explaining the reasons behind it. Watch how most people decline something, a request, an invitation, a favor. It rarely stays at no. It turns into a small essay, a list of justifications, an anxious effort to make sure the other person isn't upset by the decision. A man who's stopped needing external validation for his choices can say no, cleanly, without the paragraph of justification trailing behind it. Not rudely. Just completely. The reasons are his. He doesn't need to submit them for approval before the answer is allowed to stand. 9th, and this is the one most people underestimate the value of until they see it in action. You stay level when everyone around you is losing composure. A crisis hits, at work, at home, doesn't matter where. Watch what happens to the room. Most people's stress becomes contagious almost instantly, voices rising, decisions getting rushed, panic spreading faster than the actual problem. And then there's the one person in the room whose voice doesn't change pitch, whose questions stay practical, who somehow makes the chaos feel smaller just by being unaffected by it. That's not because he cares less. It's because somewhere along the way, he built the internal architecture to separate the size of a problem from the size of his reaction to it. Marcus Aurelius, commanding armies during plagues and wars simultaneously, wrote that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. He wasn't being poetic for the sake of it. He was describing an operating principle: chaos is data, not a verdict, and the man who can receive it as data instead of a personal attack is the man everyone else in the room ends up looking to, whether he asked for that role or not. By now you can probably feel it, this isn't a personality quiz. It's a mirror, and it's been getting sharper with every point. And the 10th, the one that ties everything together. You keep your standards even when keeping them costs you relationships, approval, or comfort. This is the most expensive item on the entire list, and it's exactly why so few people ever actually reach it. It's one thing to have standards when they're convenient, when everyone around you shares them, when holding the line costs you nothing. It's another thing entirely to hold them when they isolate you, when they cost you a friendship. When they make you the only person in the room who won't go along with something everyone else has quietly accepted. Seneca made a distinction that's easy to nod along with and brutally hard to actually live. He said it's not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. And most of that waste comes from living according to other people's expectations instead of your own considered judgment. Every time you compromise a standard to keep the peace, to stay liked, to avoid the discomfort of being the exception in the room, you're spending a piece of that limited time on someone else's version of your life. So here's the honest part, the part self-improvement content almost never says out loud, because it doesn't sell as well as the version where becoming disciplined makes everyone love you more. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes doing these 10 things costs you people. Some relationships were only functioning because you were reactive, because you could be talked into things, because you needed their approval enough to bend for it. When that need disappears, some of those relationships won't survive the change, and that's not a flaw in the process. That's the process working exactly as it should. You weren't meant to keep every relationship that only worked because of the parts of you that were holding you back. What you gain instead is something quieter and, over time, far more valuable. People stop testing you, because they can tell there's nothing to find. Rooms settle when you walk into them instead of tensing up. Your word starts carrying weight it didn't carry before, not because you talk about your standards, but because you've simply stopped breaking them where nobody would have noticed. You become someone people describe, when you're not in the room, in a specific and increasingly rare way, steady. That word gets used less and less as the years go on, because fewer and fewer people are actually building the internal architecture required to earn it. None of this happens through a single decision. It happens the way Marcus Aurelius built it, one page at a time, one private correction at a time, across years nobody was watching. You will fail most of these more often than you succeed at first. That's not the disqualifying part. The disqualifying part is deciding the failure means the whole project isn't for you, and going back to the old programming because at least it's familiar. Familiar was never the goal. Normal was never the goal. Pick one thing from this list. Not all 10. 1. The one that made you the most uncomfortable while you were listening, because that discomfort is pointing directly at the exact place your old programming is still running the show. Practice interrupting it, once, this week. Just once. That single interruption is the entire beginning of everything on this list, and it's a decision nobody around you will notice you making, right up until the day they notice you've already changed. Most people will spend their entire lives reacting. You only have to stop once to start becoming someone they can't quite explain.